Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. After studying at Peking University, the University of California at Berkeley, Harvard, and being elected Prize Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, he received his PhD in Oriental Studies from Cambridge University in 1966. Before joining the faculty of Cornell in 1972, Professor Bernal taught at Cambridge and also at the University of London. He is best known for his multi-volume work, Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, of which volumes 1 and 2 are already published. Volume 1 is titled The Fabrication of Andean Greece, 1785 to 1985, and Volume 2 is titled The Archaeological and Documentary Evidence, and Volume 3 and 4 have already been accepted for publication. Volume 3 is titled The Egyptian and West Semitic Components of Greek Civilization, The Linguistic Evidence, and Volume 4 is titled Solving the Riddle of the Sphinx and Other Studies in Egypto-Greek Mythology. Professor Bernal's major thesis, as you will hear tonight, is that because of anti-Semitism and racism, scholars during the 18th and 19th centuries excised Egypt and Canaan from the family tree of Western civilization. They dismissed the ancient Greeks' own accounts of how Egyptian and Canaanite philosophy, political theory, and technology helped to shape their world. For this multi-volume work, he has been awarded the ANC Kwanzaa Prize, the Socialist Review Book Award, and the American Book Award for 1990. He also has published numerous books and articles on China since the Revolution and on ancient civilization. He reads hieroglyphics and is fluent in Greek, Hebrew, Coptic, Chinese, French, German, Japanese, and Vietnamese. His controversial Afrocentric conclusions about Greek origins have led to heated debate among numerous scholars of many disciplines. He has been interviewed by the BBC and on numerous networks in the United States. Dr. Bernal was a central figure in recent articles on Afrocentrism in Newsweek and also in the New Republic. It is my pleasure to introduce to the Xavier University community, the community of New Orleans, Professor Martin Bernal.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming. I hope people at the back can hear me, and this is not going to explode before I get any further. First of all, I'd like a slight modification of part of the introduction, in that although Newsweek said that I was fluent in all these languages, it isn't true. I have used material in all of these languages, and a number of my friends said, what about Latin? Or what about, anyhow, we will leave that. But, and so there are problems with that. But basically, I'm delighted to be here and very grateful to Professor Mueller for making the arrangements with me, and for Professor Frye at SUNO for arranging the other half of my trip to New Orleans, and also to the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for giving me my first opportunity to visit New Orleans, which I have always wanted to visit ever since I was 10 years old. So it's a wonderful opportunity occasion for me. Now, most of the talk this evening I will devote to Volume 2, the volume on archaeology. But I think for those of you who haven't quite got round to reading the books yet, I better give a rather more general introduction to the project as a whole. Now, my work is concerned with the origins of ancient Greece. And I have found it useful to set up two general schemes or models into which I place most of the earlier descriptions and explanations of these origins. And I call these two models the ancient and the Aryan models. Now, when I was taught ancient history, I was taught it according to the ancient model. Sorry, according to the Aryan model. By the Aryan model, I mean a model of Greek history according to which Greece, or the territory we now call Greece, was invaded from the north by people speaking an Indo-European language. The Indo-European language family is a family of languages that include nearly all the languages of Europe and the languages of Iran and also the languages of North India. That's why it's called Indo-European. And this language family originated with a single language somewhere to the north of Greece, probably in what is now the Ukraine above the Black Sea, but that's a question of debate, but certainly to the north of Greece. Now, according to the Aryan model, these people invaded Greece, conquering the native inhabitants of Greece, who were somehow civilized but soft. And Greek civilization is seen as the result of the dynamic Aryans. People slipped from language groups to ethnic groups to race, so these were seen as the Aryan race rather than just merely the speakers of Indo-European languages. Anyhow, this Greek culture is the result of this mixture of the native population of Greece with invaders from the north. Now, this view of ancient Greek history or origins is only about 150 years old, and that's a very short period of time when one thinks of the time scale with which we're operating, which is over thousands of years, not hundreds of years. Before 1800, a very different view of the origins of Greece was held, and this is the view that I call the ancient model. Now, according to this, the ancestors of the Greeks had lived in idyllic simplicity in the Aegean, and along had come Phoenicians, that is, the merchant people who lived on the shores of the Levant, what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine. The coastal areas along this area had people who were called Phoenicians, and they and other settlers from Egypt were supposed to have gone to Greece and set up kingdoms in Greece and introduced the arts of civilization to the more primitive natives. And they were specifically supposed to have introduced writing, the alphabet, irrigation, various types of weapons, and religion. All these things were supposed to have been introduced from Phoenicia and from Egypt in this period, which they said was about 1,000 years before their time. Now, the writers I'm talking about were writing in the classical period, that is the period from 500 to 300 BC, which is generally seen, conventionally seen, as the peak of Greek civilization. So you have this view established then and accepted really in various forms up till 1800. And around 1820, you have this view abandoned, and 20 years later, you have the Aryan model established. And volume 1 on the historiography is essentially concerned with this shift, why scholars abandoned the ancient model at this time and why they took on the Aryan one. Now, when one's looking at the history of scholarship or of science, there are two basic approaches one can take, which are conventionally called internalist or externalist. Internalist developments or changes are what is going on inside the discipline. Who has made what experiment, who has written what article, who read that article, who is corresponding with it, who is meeting whom, and by tracing what goes on within the discipline, you can see how changes take place. But that's not the only way of looking at these changes. There's also the externalist approach. That is to look at what is going on in society as a whole, what the demands of a society are. I mean, at a crude level, you could say that brain surgery increased massively during the First World War. And the reason for this was that there were a lot of brains to operate on, and a lot of government money was gone into this. Now, that's a crude externalist stimulus to scientific development. You could say a more general or subtle one is what happened with Darwinism. Now, Charles Darwin developed his theory for natural history, natural selection, the struggle for survival, and he was quite explicit that this model of struggle had come to him from Malthus, the sociologist, And Malthus had clearly drawn his image of struggling human beings from the society in which he was living in the 1830s and 1840s, a society in which laissez-faire capitalism was the norm and the desirable, he saw it as a desirable form of society. And therefore, in some ways, what Darwin was doing was projecting Victorian society onto natural history. Now, that doesn't mean that he was wrong. It just means that you can see why Darwin arose at that time rather than, in that society, in England, rather than in another society. So external forces have an important impact on the way in which science develops. Now, if one's looking at the abandonment of the ancient model, I looked for internalist reasons. Now, during the 19th century, during the 1800s, a number of vital discoveries were made about the ancient world. Hieroglyphs, the Egyptian writing were deciphered. Cuneiform, the writing of Babylonia, was deciphered. Archaeology began in Greece to deal with the Bronze Age and the early periods. But in fact, all of these striking developments took place after the ancient model had been abandoned. And therefore, they're unlikely to have caused the abandonment of the ancient model, because usually things are not caused by events that take place later. That this is a good general rule. So that you have the ancient model the abandonment of the ancient model has to be explained for other reasons, and I think essentially it can be explained for externalist reasons. What was going on in the society in which the scholars in this period, the Northern European scholars, were living. And I think, to put it crudely, there were three major factors behind it. These were the establishment of the paradigm of progress, the rise of romanticism, and racism. Now, the paradigm of progress is the idea that the long-term passage of time means things get bigger and better. Now, this is not a common way of looking at the passage of time. In most societies, people see things as getting worse or as going round in circles, but not as improvement, or not, at least not as improvement in this world. There are many societies where you can get improvement in the next world, and the saints will come marching in some spiritual sense, but the idea of steady improvement in this world is rare, but it's important for us because it's the dominant model we use when looking at the passage of time, and it really became established in Europe around 1700 in Northern Europe. Now, before that time, people had taken the declining view, and therefore, in those days, earlier was better. Therefore, the fact that ancient Egypt was earlier than ancient Greece, and there was no question about that, meant that ancient Egypt was somehow superior to ancient Greece. That Greece was seen as a newcomer, a superficial, shallow culture compared to Egypt and the East. By that they meant Mesopotamia. So you have this idea being reversed, that it now became better to be later. Later became better, and therefore Greece, as the new culture, was now seen as in some ways superior to Egypt. Now, this story is epitomized in a story told by, this pattern is epitomized in a story told by Plato about the Athenian statesman Solon, who had visited Egypt and had a conversation with some priests at the Egyptian capital of the time, which was at Sais, near the present Alexandria. And the priests, and Solon had started to tell the priests some Greek myths and legends, and the priests had interrupted and said, "Pathetic, you Greeks know nothing. You are all children. You know nothing, you remember nothing." And this story was used until about 1700 to put down the Greeks, to say, look, the Greeks are children, and therefore inferior to the mature Egyptians. However, once you get the progressive paradigm in place, then childhood becomes an age pointing to the future, and therefore seen as a better age, and therefore the image of Greeks as children, which had been a liability, now became an asset. And the image of the Egyptians as old men, which had been a sign of their wisdom and maturity, now became a sign of their infertility, that they weren't going on to produce anything in the future. So this story, which was frequently referred to, changed its significance in a dramatic way. Now, at some level, childhood can be seen as being at the appreciation of childhood can be seen as being at the intersection of progress and romanticism. Now, what do I mean by romanticism? Essentially, I mean, and this is a fairly conventional meaning, the inadequacy of reason. Now, romanticism grew up as a counterpoint, or as a opposition, to the Enlightenment which emphasized reason and the accessibility of reason to all men, and they were pretty consciously sexist about this when they said that, but that all men of all cultures were accessible to reason was very important. Now, the Romantics revolted against this and said what is important is emotion, and not all people can share emotions. You have to share a community, share living conditions, share things to be in touch with each other. So Romantics took this very different approach. Now, people of the Enlightenment liked stability. What they liked were large empires which lasted for a long time. So for the Enlightenment, the ideal societies were empires like the Roman Empire, like the Chinese Empire, and like the Egyptian Empire. And as the Enlightenment was very skeptical about Christianity, they tended to prefer empires without revealed religion, so that they took on this, and so they also tended to secularize the societies which they admired, or secularize the image of the societies which they admired. So what you get in the Enlightenment is what in some ways is paradoxical, the image of the Egyptian priests becoming as the detached philosophers who are guiding society in its best interests. And this was taken on in a very concrete form by the Freemasons, who saw themselves as the Egyptian priests of the present age, and this can be seen in the symbols they used. And we can see this particularly strongly in this country, in the United States. What is the emblem, or what are the emblems on the Great Seal of the United States? Pyramid and the eye. I mean, the use of two Masonic interpretations of Egyptian symbols are used there. And that's not all. If you look at the planning of Washington, D.C., a very careful geometrical layout with obelisks Egyptian-style obelisks at key points, very much associated with Freemasonry. This association between Freemasonry and ancient Egypt, or their interpretation of ancient Egypt, is very strong. I don't know if any of you have seen the film, or the opera, which was filmed, of The Magic Flute. Mozart's great opera, which is a very Masonic opera, but it has as its key enlightened figure Sarastro, the high priest of Isis and Osiris. So you have this very strong association. Now, Romantics were the opposite of the Enlightenment. They liked small, dynamic societies which were turbulent and changing, because they believed these formed communities and that they were dynamic. And what the Romantics liked was dynamism rather than stability. And therefore, they liked Greece rather than Rome, because the Greek city-states were small and they were extraordinarily unstable. They kept on changing and fighting and squabbling, and therefore they were ideal from the Enlightenment, from the Romantic point of view, but they were lacking one component. And that is that Romantics believe in the benefits of cold, that cold is good for you, and that heat is bad for you. Is a very strong Romantic view, excuse me. Sorry, have people at the back not been hearing me? You can now. Okay, that cold is good for you. Now, the idea that cold is good for the martial spirit or for chastity is something that's been very ancient and long. There's been a long belief in this, that these things are very deep, and that Aristotle believed it. And Aristotle said, the people to the north are barbaric and valiant, but they're stupid. The people to the south are ingenious and clever, but they tend to be of a slavish disposition. We Greeks happily have it the right. We have the best mixture of both. The same is true of the Arabs. Said the same thing, that we're the right sort of people. There's some people who are too pale and too barbaric, and there's some people who are too dark and too and not clever, but they're not moral in the way that we are. So this idea of being in the center is a very strong one. However, Romantics living in Northern Europe in the 18th century started a new line, which was that cold was good for the intelligence as well as for morality. And that was something strikingly new. And it's something that I was brought up with. I went to Cambridge, not to Oxford, and therefore I was brought up to believe that we were more intelligent than the people at Oxford because we had cold east winds coming down from the North Pole with no geographical barrier, whereas Oxford, in an inland river valley with miasmic, swampish things, they couldn't really think very well at all. So you have this view of the cold. We were also encouraged to go to the Lake District in northern England to get cold and wet and uncomfortable, and this would somehow get the synapses open and that we would think in a better way. Or go to Switzerland to go high up mountains. So that this is a very pervasive, and living in Ithaca, I must believe it to some extent, that there's this belief. Of course, the converse to this is that you aren't supposed to be able to think in hot climates. And this then links up to racism in a very profound way, that you cannot think in the tropics or even in uncomfortable climates. Now, just to underline the absurdity of this view, do any of you know where the American Constitution was drafted? Pennsylvania. Where in Pennsylvania? Philadelphia. Do you know what season it was drafted? Summer. Have any of you been in Philadelphia in summer? And it was a particularly hot summer that they drafted it. Also, do any of you know what happened to the windows in the Constitution Hall? They were sealed for secrecy. And of course these people were wearing wigs and God knows what, but there was a whole lot of stuff here, so that there was a great deal of trouble. They did forget the Bill of Rights, but it's on the whole a very good document that you really have, it's a very impressive thing, and it is possible, clearly, to think in hot climates, or in hot temperatures. But the belief that it's impossible becomes very important in the story we're telling in this way. So that you have the romantic belief that cold is good. Therefore, the countries that the romantics really liked were Scotland or Switzerland. It didn't matter whether you went north or whether you went high, as long as you were cold. That was the essential thing. Now, Greece was ideal in many ways, except that it was on the Mediterranean and in a rather comfortable climate. And so even in the 18th century, in the 1700s, Romantic thinkers started thinking that perhaps the Greeks weren't formed in Greece, that they were formed somewhere to the north in a more demanding climate, and that they had somehow preserved this northern energy and intelligence when they had come to the Mediterranean. So you have this romantic view of Greece as the ideal country, somehow needing a northern injection to make it ideal. Now, beyond that, you have the third major factor, which is racism. Now, I don't need to say, too much about racism, because we all know it's here and present and in every nook and cranny of our society. And that racism or racial prejudice is something that occurs in many societies. But the obsessional racism that we have in Europe and North America today is something that fortunately has been rather rare in human history, and it emerged in the 17th century, in the 1600s. And the extreme caste belief that somehow the worst white was better than the best black, and this extremity is something that has never existed elsewhere, but it became a major force in Western intellectual, Western intellectual world from the 1700s. And the reason for this is clearly the need to be able to justify slaving, the slave trade. If you consider yourself a good person, you don't behave atrociously to other human beings. And the way round this is to dehumanize the people you are behaving inhumanly towards. And therefore, West Africans had to be turned into animals or devils in order to justify the slave trade. And as animals or devils, West Africans had to be made at the opposite pole of civilization, as far from civilization as you could become or get. Now, this made it very awkward because, as far as Egypt was concerned, because Egypt was inconveniently placed on the African continent. And Egypt was seen as the ancestral culture of Europe. I mean, this was generally conceded. So how do you deal with the problem? Well, the way in which the Enlightenment thinkers dealt with it was to say Egypt was civilized, it remained the source of Western culture, but that it was white, that it was somehow detached from the rest of Africa. The way in which the Romantics dealt with it was to say, yes, Egypt was African, but it was uncivilized. So in both methods, you make the essential break between Central and West Africans and civilization. You have a barrier between the two. The way that has taken over in the late 19th and 20th century has tended to be a combination of both, and that is to say that Egypt wasn't really civilized and it wasn't really black. So you can have this double barrier between the two. Now, at this point, I better set out where I stand on this issue. First of all, there's no question, ancient Egypt was an African civilization. It seems ridiculous to have to spell this out, but I have to do this. First of all, it was in Africa, explicitly Africa. Secondly, the language of ancient Egypt belonged to the Afro-Asiatic language family, which is a language family that has 6 members which are exclusively in Africa, and the 7th member of the Afro-Asiatic language family, Semitic, is partly in Africa and partly in Southwest Asia. And there's no doubt that the source of origin of the Afro-Asiatic family was in Africa, and I believe to the south of Egypt. I mean, this is a question of scholarly debate, but there's no question that the origin was in Africa. So that geographically and linguistically, there's no question. If one looks at the language, there's another aspect, which is there are various ways in which Egyptian is not like some of the other Afro-Asiatic languages. And some of these reasons may be that there were influences from African languages belonging to other language families, particularly the Niger-Congo language family, which is the language family of West Africa and including the Bantu subfamily there. But I still follow Greenberg in believing that it's essentially an Afro-Asiatic language, but I also am moving towards Job's position that there may have been linguistic contact of a fairly substantial sort with West African languages, which took place before the formation of Egyptian culture in the Sahara, when the Sahara was a savanna, or large areas of the Sahara were a savanna, in which you have a mixed population, and some of that population then moves to the Nile. So that linguistically there's no question. Also, if one looks at the pharaonic system, which in a way is the characteristic of Egypt, we now know that it began probably in Nubia, or at least in Nubia and Upper Egypt in the Middle Nile. so that you have it rather than on the Lower Nile in the delta. So there's no question about its characteristic African nature. And the population of pre-dynastic Upper Egypt and Nubia seems to have been very like the population of Nubia today, or the population of Ethiopia in that way. That is to say, it is not like a West African population. It is an East African population with some Central and West African admixtures. And the Lower Egypt was essentially of a North African type, which is in some ways Caucasoid. And once you get a unification of Egypt, you get a mixture of these types and a very varied population. And this varied image of ancient Egypt we are misled to some extent by Egyptian paintings, which tend to portray a relatively uniform population of red-brown men and yellow-white women. And this, I think, is essentially an Egyptian desire to portray Egyptianness, rather so homogenizing the Egyptian population, whereas the physical remains indicate a much greater variety in the Egyptian population. And so, in a way, the Egyptian paintings of Egyptians are stereotypes of this homogenized population, just as there were stereotypes of people to the south and peoples to the north. Now, but the mixture of the physical types, all of which were African, and let me stress that there is more variety of physical types in Africa than in the rest of the world put together. And this is true from physical appearance, but it's also now, we can tell from the mitochondrial DNA, the people working in the Eve hypothesis show that in terms of DNA or mitochondrial DNA, there is much more variety within Africa than in the rest of the world put together. So that the fact that some of the lower Egyptians looked Caucasoid doesn't mean that they weren't African themselves, so that I think we're dealing with an African population. But it does mean that there were ways in which people who wanted to portray the whites could exaggerate the Caucasoid elements in the Egyptian population, and that's the way in which I think it took place. Now, in the early 19th century, you have a conjunction of these three forces: the paradigm of progress, the triumph of Romanticism over the Enlightenment, which took place after the failure of the French Revolution, and the racism reaching all aspects of Northern European culture, including history. And in the early 19th century, the great excitement of history was indeed the ethnic principle, which they were surprised that previous historians had failed to realize, that history should be seen as the biography of peoples and the working out of racial identity, so that you have this idea that there are racial identities which go through different forms but retain the same essence. And remember, this is a period of extraordinary European triumphs and expansions throughout the world. And the belief, the problem that faced Europeans in the 19th century was, how are we so great? I mean, how do we face up to this? And wanting to find historical explanations for this, and to go back into the past and project Europe's contemporary triumphs into the past. And there was this very great difficulty with the ancient model, with its idea of colonization of Greece, because if you followed racial science, which they believed it was in the early 19th century, it was impossible that a conquest by inferior races could have had productive results, and there's no doubt that Greece was seen as a creative culture, and therefore it was becoming scientifically impossible to believe in what the Greeks had said. So you get this denial of the widespread Greek traditions of Egyptian, of settlement from Egypt or Phoenician settlement. And that means that there is was a sustained attack on the ancient model in the 1820s, which was reinforced powerfully by the Greek War of Independence that took place at the same time, in which Greece struggled for independence against the Turkish rulers, and the Turkish rulers were aided by the rulers of Egypt, with their armies. So it was seen by Europeans as a struggle between young Europe and old Asia, and that to support modern Greeks fighting for their freedom was somehow associated with the Persian Wars of the Greeks of the classical period, and a denial of the possibility of non-European influences in Greece, which had now become the ideal form, the childhood of Europe, the ideal form of Europe, the best country ever. This is not something that West Europeans had believed until the 18th century, but it comes in increasing force with the rise of Romanticism. So I think it's for these reasons, in this atmosphere, that the ancient model was abandoned, not because of any scholarly advances. However, I want to distinguish between the abandonment of the ancient model and the rise of the Aryan model, because the Aryan model had a very important internalist component to its emergence, and that was the working out of the Indo-European language family and the recognition that Greek was a charter member of the Indo-European language family. However, it was a very peculiar member of the Indo-European family, because although it's basically a member, about half the vocabulary and 80% of the proper nouns, the names of places, the names of gods, the names of all sorts of mythical beings, cannot be explained in terms of Indo-European. And that's why you needed to invent the pre-Hellenes, the people who had existed before, if you're working in the Aryan model, before the invasion of the Indo-Europeans, to explain this large non-Indo-European component to Greek vocabulary and to Greek culture. So that the Aryan model had all the externalist forces behind it that I've mentioned before, plus this very powerful internalist one. Now, what I propose is not a straight reversion to the ancient model, but what I call the revised ancient model. That is, I accept that Greek is an Indo-European language, and that at some very early stage there was cultural influence of some form that may have taken the form of migration, may have been invasions, which made Greek Indo-European. However, I don't see why that is mutually exclusive with the ancient tradition of these settlements from the south and east, and I also believe that the bulk of the non-Indo-European segment of the Greek language and the Greek names are in fact Egyptian or Semitic. And in some of this I have ancient testimony that Herodotus, the first Greek historian, is explicit when he says that the Egyptians taught us, the Greeks, the names of the gods. And a number of scholars have in the last 100 years said, what did Herodotus mean by names? Unfortunately, the word is very clear. It means names. And so I have been looking at the various names. Gods are very slippery creatures, and they have numbers of names. And I've been looking at the various names Egyptian gods were given, and there's no doubt that I think I can find plausible etymologies for a large number of Greek gods from Egyptian, which have baffled scholars who have been looking at the Indo-European sources, scholars, or at the pre-Hellenic sources, scholars of far greater linguistic knowledge than me, of great capacity for hard work, what the Germans call Sitzfleisch, the capacity to sit for a long time and keep your working, but also of great intelligence. And they failed to come up with anything, and a rank amateur can come in and follow the Greek indications, and I think I've come up with many more fruitful results in this way. So that I think that the revised ancient model, which accepts both the northern influence and the major Egyptian and Semitic components, is a much more plausible model here. Now, when I use the word plausible, I am using it deliberately, because when one's dealing with ancient history, it is hard, if not impossible, to be certain. It's conventional for people defending the status quo, defending conventional wisdom, to demand proof of anyone who is challenging them. This, I think, is unfair, because it implies that their conventional wisdom is itself based on proof, which when one's dealing with ancient history is very far indeed from the case. It is not. So that all I'm arguing is that I should work in a thing of providing a scheme that is more plausible than the conventional wisdom, rather than providing hard and fast proof that my case is right, because their case isn't proven either. That is the outline of Volume 1. I'm sorry, I may have said that it's possible to think in hot climates. It's not so possible to sit and listen in hot climates, and I appreciate your patience, because I also know it's much easier to speak than it is to listen. Now, so I will talk a little, not quite in the detail I'd intended, about Volumes 2 and 3. Volume 2 on the archaeology, which is already out, and Volume 3 on language. Now, when talking about archaeology, I'm afraid I must add another model for the origins of Greek civilization, and this is a model called by its proponent, Colin Renfrew, professor of classical archaeology in Cambridge, the model of autochthonous development. Very fancy name, but it means that Greece is essentially a local culture, having no invasions from the north and no invasions from the south. So it's not belonging to the Aryan model or to the ancient model. Now, this and that the only invasion of Greece took place at the beginning of the Neolithic, and nothing really has happened there since. Now, this is inherently rather implausible, given the fact that Greece is a peninsula in the eastern Mediterranean, where it picks up a lot that's going on, but still, he has been pushing it. And this is part of a general movement within archaeology for isolationism. There are two poles of archaeological interpretation: diffusionism and isolationism. Diffusion means that the belief that cultures or parts of cultures or whole cultures can travel and be imposed on other societies, and isolationism is the belief that all developments are essentially local and substantially unaffected by what goes on outside. Now, clearly, neither extreme can really work. That even the case of the United States, where one would think there's diffusion of of European culture into North America, we find, despite the genocide of the Native American population, we find a surprising number of American cultural traits have survived in the population. So that, I mean, it's not just turkeys and corn, but it's also traditions of town meetings, ideas of confederation, all sorts of things have come from, partly at least, from North American populations. So that one should never talk entirely of crude diffusionism or of, I believe, of crude isolationism, because I believe that outside contacts do modify cultures. Now, so what I propose is a return to the standard view in the early 20th century of modified diffusionism. Now, the archaeologists of the early 20th century only applied this to the very early history of Greece. They didn't apply it to the period once they believed that the Aryans had moved in. But they did believe that Greece had been influenced by the Near East before the Greeks had, the Hellenes had arrived. But I believe that this Greece remained, and remains today, a culture of cultural meetings. If you go to Greece today from Western Europe, you feel you're entering the Near East. If you go from the Near East to Greece today, you feel you're entering Europe. It is this wonderful marginal situation. Now, so my basic principle in looking at the history of Greece is to look at it from the point of view of modified diffusion. That you get waves of influence coming from various directions, but particularly from the south and east, and these waves are fitted in to the local culture and create something new. And then that receives another wave. And so it's a very complicated pattern of layering of this type. And I see 5 basic stages of influence from the south and east. The first of these took place about 3000 plus BC, 3200 BC, and it's the beginning of the early Bronze Age. The second one took place about 2500 BC, and it's the height of the early Bronze Age. The third one took place in Crete, and it was the formation of the Cretan palaces and the bull cult in Crete, about 2100 BC. The fourth is the one that I believe the Greek tradition refers to, which is invasions of Greece by Hyksos. Hyksos, Hyksos, is the name given by the Egyptians for people who invaded Egypt from the northeast and conquered Egypt for 150 years. And I believe that their composite culture, which was Egyptian and Semitic and Southwest Asian, was in fact the culture of the people who invaded Greece around 1700 BC. And the fifth period is the period of Late Bronze Age, which is the period of the great 18th dynasty of Egypt, when I think that it imposed a general Pax Egyptiaca, a sphere of influence around the East Mediterranean that included Greece, and there were certainly major cultural borrowings at this time which didn't involve conquest, although the Egyptians may have sent a couple of punitive expeditions to Greece at that time. Now, the early Bronze Age, you know, the sequence of ages from stone to bronze to Iron Age, when the predominant material from which tools and weapons were made is named after the stone and bronze. And so bronze casting and bronze hammering came in to the Aegean about 3200 BC, and it's pretty clear that it and various other things that came with it, the wheel for making pottery, had developed earlier in the Near East and came in at this stage. And I believe it's at this stage that Crete became a predominantly Semitic-speaking language. Now, in the middle of the third millennium, around 2500 BC, you have a period of enormous prosperity in Greece. You have states existing with so-called houses of tiles, and in a number of regions, particularly in the area around the Greek Thebes, you have large-scale irrigation works begun, and the archaeologist who's done most work in Boeotia, which is the province in which the Greek Thebes is set, sees the techniques as closer to Egyptian techniques, and it's striking because a structure very similar to a pyramid was built near the city of Thebes at the same period. So it seems clear to him, and I'm convinced, that there was heavy cultural influence from Egypt on mainland Greece around this time. Now, I'm not prepared to say that it was colonization, but I am prepared to say that there was heavy Egyptian influence this time. You also find Egyptian-type granaries built, and these granaries are very interesting because they are huge, and I think represent a use of irrigation to produce large agricultural surpluses, which were then brought together by substantial states. And this is this is beginning to be accepted, but the conventional view is still that early Bronze Age Greece was a society of small villages, basically autarkic, that is, living off their own wealth. So that I think even in the early Bronze Age there was much more contact with the East Mediterranean in general and Egypt in particular. Now, in Crete, you have the Cretan civilization developing various characteristics in the early Bronze Age, but something very new happening about 2100 BC with the beginning of the palaces. You may know pictures of the palace of Knossos, but there were other palaces built in Crete. And this is associated, and the new arguments among archaeologists are saying this isn't a smooth evolution from early Bronze Age Crete to the palaces, but represents what they call punctuated equilibrium, a break. And a number of the archaeologists are beginning to see this break associated with contact with Asia and Egypt, and it coincides very neatly with the 11th dynasty of Egypt, which is the southern Egyptian dynasty, which reunited Egypt after the first intermediate period, the first breakdown. So you have, and at this point, the chief god of the 11th dynasty was a god called Mont, who was a god who was either a falcon or a bull, or a bull-headed god, and it is at this point that for the first time you see the bull cult emerging in Crete. Now, it's rather strange to have a bull cult in Crete because essentially it's a mountainous island which would be much more suitable for goats than for bulls. And archaeologists have had some puzzle explaining it, and the best that they've come up with is that there was a bull cult occur in many different places in the world. I'm not saying it's unique to Egypt, but the best that they've come up with is a bull cult in Turkey, which existed 3,000 years earlier still, so that it would seem to me much more plausible that it derived from contemporary Egypt than that it did from equally distant Turkey 3,000 years earlier. But there are blinders on the eyes of the archaeologists. They don't want to look south when they're dealing with the Aegean. They'd far prefer to look to Turkey, which is Asianic rather than Asiatic, and therefore and more sort of Indo-European-ish than the Semitic Levant or Egyptian East. So I think that the bull cult comes in at the same time as the palaces, and the bull cult at least specifically points towards Egypt. Here again, one doesn't know what form it took, but the change was relatively rapid and may have taken the form of colonization, but we don't know, and I don't think, and the Greek tradition doesn't refer to it. What the Greek tradition does refer to are the Hyksos invasions. And here I'm not being original, that if one looks at the Cambridge Ancient History, which is a canonical history of the ancient world, the article on the origin of Mycenaean Greece, that is late Bronze Age Greece, the Greece which is known by the great finds at Mycenae, which was the capital of Agamemnon, the leader of the Trojan War expedition by the Greeks. Anyhow, in Mycenae, you have a massive series of graves with spectacular finds. The most famous of these are gold masks of very fierce-looking warriors, but you also find a whole lot of weapons. It's a society that valued war, and it's a society of very sharp class demarcations, that the rich are buried much more lavishly than the poor. And therefore, in the Cambridge Ancient History, the man who has written the main article of it maintains that this represents the Greek tradition of warriors coming in from Egypt and Phoenicia and setting up kingdoms, specifically in Argos, which is the general province in which Mycenae is found. This is a minority position, but it's a respectable minority position. Where the author of this thing differs from me and from the revised ancient model is that he says, yes, this was the Hyksos bringing in Egyptian and Semitic culture into Greece, but it had no lasting effect on Greek culture, that it all just disappeared. Now, one thing that's striking about the material culture of Mycenaean Greece was its continuity, that you find the same artistic motifs lasting for 500 years in Bronze Age Greece. And so the idea of a breakdown of this earlier culture seems to me inherently very implausible indeed, and that one would expect, other things being equal, there to be a continuity. And other things are not equal. They are, in fact, very much, I believe, in favor of a belief in massive Semitic and Egyptian components in the Greek language and in the Greek mythology. And Herodotus says he thinks that Danaus, who was one of the hero who was supposed to have come from Egypt and gone to Argos, in fact had taught his daughters, had taught the Greeks how to worship, to go through various rituals, so that the idea that these settlements were important in the introduction of Egyptian culture was around. Now, a very sensational discovery, adjustment to archaeology has occurred in the last 3 years, and that is the redating of a huge eruption that took place in the Greek island of Thera. Now, Thera is an island which is very sensational to visit. I can recommend it to any of you because you sail into the old caldera or cauldron of a volcano. You encounter cliffs around 2/3, and it is the remains of a huge volcano that blew and put so much dust into the atmosphere that it caused a mini-nuclear winter. And this mini-nuclear winter shows up in tree rings because you have smaller growth patterns, you have frosts in summer. It shows up in tree rings as far away as Ireland and as Colorado and California. So that now the dendrochronologists, the people who measure time through counting tree rings, are quite clear that this took place in 1628 BC. They don't mess around. They don't give you vague 50 years, 100 years, but they give you absolute precision. Now, this has blown everyone's minds because they'd all assumed that it took place 150 years earlier. But under the ash of this volcano on Thera, a town has been excavated which is in even better condition than the Roman city of Pompeii, which was covered by Vesuvius. And on these walls you can see a number of paintings. And these paintings portray a very sophisticated, highly hierarchical society with a number of very striking Egyptian features in this society. Boats that look like Egyptian boats carrying around images, as well as rowers or paddlers, and a number of archaeologists have in fact interpreted the very complicated structure of these frescoes in terms of the Hebsed festival, an Aegean version. I mean, these paintings couldn't have been painted in Egypt in the normal sense, but they are, in their style, like the Cretan paintings, very much influenced by Egyptian style. That there are many Egyptian animals and plants that don't occur in the Aegean, and there are also Egyptian styles in the way in which paintings are made, that the lilies or the papyrus plants are not painted naturalistically, but according to the Egyptian conventions of painting, so that you can see both in the content and the form of these paintings, you can see heavy Egyptian influence. Now, that was all right, or marginally all right, if you dated the eruption to 1450 BC. You could say it was Egyptian influence under the great 18th dynasty. But now we know it's in the 17th century, in the 1600s BC, much earlier, and this is the period after the Hyksos invasion. So that I think that this is a very striking thing. And since Volume 2 came out, 2 more discoveries have been made of Cretan-type paintings in the Hyksos capital in Egypt, at Avaris or at Tel Daba, and also in the Galilee, in Israel-Palestine. So you have this being very influential in showing that there was a cultural commonality around the East Mediterranean in the 17th century BC. And if one has contact in the East Mediterranean, there's no doubt that the predominant cultural flow will be from the older established civilizations in Egypt and Southwest Asia to Greece, although, as we see from these Cretan paintings, there is a counterflow as well. Now, there is now no contest about the extent of Egyptian influence around 1500 to 1200 BC, that the number of Egyptian and Levantine objects found in the Aegean is overwhelming, and the number of Aegean pots and traces of metals mined in the Aegean are now overwhelming. But it's still maintained that this didn't have a profound cultural influence on mythology or on language, that the material exchanges are admitted, the linguistic ones are not. And here I'd like to use an analogy that in many ways 18th dynasty Egypt was like, and its relation to Greece was like the relationship between China and Japan. That Japan is about the same distance from China that Greece is from Egypt, and of course the sea is much harder to navigate, that the Mediterranean is relatively easy to navigate in this way. And we would be very surprised indeed if we found that Japanese culture had no traces of Chinese culture in it. In fact, it has a mass of Chinese cultural influence in it, coming in at various stages in various ways, directly or indirectly, and you don't have an invasion. You just have the higher, greater cultural depth of China affecting Japanese culture in a very profound way. And nobody who studied Japanese culture seriously would try to attempt to do it in isolation without being aware of the Chinese precedents. But that is precisely what the Aegeanists and the classicists have tried to do for Greece, that they have tried to study purely the European aspects of Greece without looking at the southern influences. If any of you have read Professor Lefkowitz's article in the New Republic recently, one of the things she argued is that you can't possibly have influence from Egypt to Greece because they are fundamentally different cultures. Their languages are unrelated. And this is absurd because Japanese fundamentally is as different from Chinese as Egyptian is from Greek. What borrowing or contacts show are present relationships, not the genetic historical relationships of the languages. That the Japanese vocabulary is full of Chinese loanwords. The Japanese names, I mean the name for Tokyo, the name for Kyoto, are all, or many of them are Chinese derived, so one has no doubt about it. So that the attempt to isolate Greece, I think, must be seen in ideological terms, because anyone looking at any other region of the world and finding huge segments of that civilization not explained would immediately turn to the neighboring cultures with which you know there was contact on archaeological grounds. And that is precisely what they have failed to do until very recently. There is now a movement, particularly on Levantine influences, but I think the political costs of admitting the Egyptian influences are so far considered very high, too high to take on. Now, to touch on reception, although this may come up in discussion, the reception of my book. What's interesting is that most of the reviewers of Volume 1, there weren't many reviews, but those who did review it, took a liberal position. That is, they said, he's right on one thing, wrong on the other thing, and we don't know about the third. And the thing I was right on was the historiography, that they found impossible to refute, that seemed to be right. What they knew I was wrong about was language, because Greek couldn't possibly be the way I said it was. It must be the way the experts said it was. And where they were hesitating was on archaeology. So you have this, and this has basically been maintained ever since. However, this is not satisfactory for the crusaders against political correctness, or the anti-multiculturalists, because they are not particularly interested in what took place in the Bronze Age. That's not of direct concern. But they are very concerned with the historiography, because the whole rationale of the Crusaders is that there was a pure scholarship which the multiculturalists and the 60s radicals have somehow hijacked and politicized. And that's why they call their organization the National Association of Scholars. Scholars unmarked, because there was a pure objective scholarship. Now, what I think I've demonstrated in Volume 1 is that classics was highly political from its inception. It was thoroughly influenced by the racism and the anti-Semitism which dealt with the Phoenicians. I haven't gone into that in detail. That it was highly political from its beginnings, and that what has changed is the political content rather than the notion that it was political or not. But this dream of the pure ivory tower, I think, is a dream, that politics always affects scholarship. But I don't want to fall into the other pit of complete relativism. And a number of deconstructionists have said to me, wonderful, you've deconstructed classics, that's terrific, you know, it's now all over, but why do you want to set up something on your own which will be equally false? And I'm not a complete relativist. I mean, I'm in this uneasy position in believing that the scholar is confronted both with the subject of his or her scholarship, but also with their own social, psychological state, that it's a very difficult and shifting balance, but that the objective facts or things out there which you can never reach completely do provide limits to what you can maintain plausibly. I think that the Aryan model stretches those limits about as far as they could be stretched. I think it's very, very far in that way. But you couldn't argue, for instance, the Greeks came from Patagonia, even though it suited Argentinian nationalism to say that they did, that there are absolute limits to what you can say. And that, absurd though I find it, the Aryan model does stay within these limits. But I believe that the ancient model and the revised ancient model are much more central within the sphere put up by the objective limits of the facts. Okay, well, I'll leave it there for questions. I'm sorry to have gone on so long, and I do appreciate your patience in sitting through in the great heat.
We will have about 20 to 30 minutes of questions. Certainly we would like to break by at least 9 o'clock.